Hey everybody, this is a quick tutorial about how to solve Punnett Square problems. In this one, I'm going to walk through the basic steps of solving a Punnett Square problem, and then I will do a couple practice problems just to show those steps in action. Okay, so to outline the steps, I've got a simple practice problem here where a plant that is heterozygous for green pods is crossed with a plant that has yellow pods. The question that we will answer is what are the probable genotype and phenotype ratios in the offspring resulting from this cross? The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to choose the letters to represent our alleles in the cross. For this example, I'm going to select a big G or uppercase G for the dominant green allele and a lowercase g or little g for the recessive allele. Next, we're going to write the genotypes of the parents. So, since the plant with green pods is heterozygous for the trait, its genotype must be big G, little g, heterozygous meaning that we have two different alleles. The problem does not state whether the plant with yellow pods is homozygous or heterozygous, but we know that yellow pods are a recessive characteristic and that the recessive characteristics are only expressed if it's homozygous recessive. So because of that, we know the genotype for the plant that is yellow must be little g, little g. And so our cross is therefore big G, little g cross little g, little g. Next, we're going to determine the possible gametes or reproductive cells that the parents can produce. Each parent will produce gametes that will only have one allele. The two alleles of the genes are going to segregate or separate during the formation of gametes. Thus, the yellow pod parent, big G, little g, will either produce a big G gamete or a little g gamete, and it'll be an equal ratio of big G gametes to little g gametes. The yellow podded parent can only produce little g's. Next, we're going to enter the possible gametes at the tops and the sides of a Punnett square. So we'll build our little Punnett square, and then we'll put the letters on the outside. Next, we're going to complete the Punnett square by writing the alleles in the appropriate boxes. So this represents the process of fertilization, in which the male gametes from one parent combine with the female gametes of the other. Each type of possible gamete from one parent is combined with each possible gamete of the other parent. So here's the example for this particular Punnett square. We would have our big G, little g on the top, and our little g on the side. We would fill in the big G down, the little g down, a little g across, a little g across, and we will see our offspring are either going to be big G, little g, or little g, little g. As you can see, half the offspring have each of these genotypes. The last step we'll do is we will determine the phenotypes of this offspring. Since big G is dominant over little g, plants that have a big G in their genotype are going to have green pods. Only with genotypes of little g are going to have yellow pods. In this example, we have half the offspring are yellow and half are green. Using steps 5 and 6, we can answer the problem. And if you remember back at the beginning, the question was, what are the possible genotypes and phenotype ratios? So in this particular example, our genotypic ratio is going to be 2 big G, little g to 2 little g, or a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 big G, little g to 1 little g, little g. The phenotypic ratio is also 2 to 2, where it's 2 green to 2 yellow, or 1 green to 1 yellow if we simplify it. So now let's look at a couple of specific practice problems. So use a Punnett square to show the offspring of a cross between two pea plants that are heterozygous for stem length. In this case, we've been given the genotypes of those parents, so it's across a big T, little t, cross big T, little t. Give the phenotypes and genotypes of the offspring. So again, we would write out our parents. This is going to be big T, little t, cross big T, little t. Next, we'll write the possible gametes. It's either going to be big T or little t for each parent, and so therefore we will fill out a big T and little t on the top of each of these Punnett square boxes. Next, we'll fill in the Punnett square. And lastly, we will fill out our genotype and phenotype ratio. In this instance, we have 1 big T to 2 big T, little t's to 1 little t. Both the big T and big T, little t will have a tall phenotype, and the little t would be short. For the next problem, round seeds are dominant over wrinkled seed. Cross a pea plant that produces round seeds but is heterozygous with a plant that has wrinkled seeds. So the parents in this case are big R, little r, cross little r, little r. Wrinkle seeds, just like in our first example, has to be little r because wrinkled is the recessive allele. Next, we would write the possible gametes, big R or little r for our first parent, and just little r's for the second parent. We then put those on the outside of the Punnett square. We fill in our Punnett square, and then from our Punnett square, we know that we'll have one big R to one little r, one round to one wrinkle. One thing to note about this, you'll see that in the possible gametes, I listed it was big R or little r cross just little r. We actually don't need the bottom two boxes in this Punnett square. If a parent only can produce one type of gamete, you actually don't need to write those bottom two boxes. A lot of people do it because it keeps all of the Punnett squares the same, but do know that it is unnecessary to do that. Next, I've got one more problem. It's about albinism, and I've got a breakdown of a few different possible questions that would be subset questions. So the first overarching background we have for this is albinism, the lack of skin pigment, can be due to a recessive gene, little a. The dominant gene, big A, results in the formation of skin pigments. The following couples come to you to find out the probability of their having any albino children. What could you tell them in the following situations? Both parents are normally pigmented, but each has one albino parent. So what are the parents? In this case, it would be big A cross big A little a. The reason for this is that if they have an albino parent, that means their albino parent must have been little a. They can only give their offspring a little a, and therefore the children have to be heterozygous. They show normal pigmentation, but they have to have received that little a from their parent that did not have what we would call quote-unquote normal pigmentation. We fill in the possible gametes. It'd be big A or little a cross big A or little a. You see the Punnett square on the side where we will then fill in that Punnett square. And we would then be able to figure out our genotypic ratio and phenotypic ratio, where we would have one big A to two big A little a's to one little a. That means that we would have three that have normal pigmentation and one who would show the absence of pigmentation, or it would be albino. Now, in our second scenario, the man is albino and the woman is normal, but her father was albino. So in this case, the woman is actually just like our parents in example A here. So the albino man will have to be little a, but the woman whose father was albino has to get that little a from her father, so therefore she must be big A, little a. In our possible gametes, we see little a, which is the father, cross big A or little a. We see those on the Punnett square. We will fill in our Punnett square, filling down the little a's across the big A's and the little a's. And we will see based off of this that 2 are big A, little a, 2 are little a. We could write that as a simplified 1-to-1 ratio. And therefore our phenotypic ratio is 1 normal to 1 albino. Letter C says the man is an albino and the woman's family includes no albinos for at least 4 generations. Now, in this case, it does lead to a little speculation. It is entirely possible that there are no albinos in this woman's family, and she is big A, little a. But based off the information that we're given, we are going to assume that the lack of albinism in her family is an indication that she is homozygous dominant. And therefore, one parent has little a, that's the albino man, and she is big A, big A. The possible gametes is that he can give a little a and she can give a big A. In this case, you'll see the Punnett square is filled in. Again, this is a case where really we don't need a 4-box Punnett square. We could do a 1-by-1 Punnett square because the father can only pass on little a's and the mother can only pass on big A's. When we fill in the Punnett square, all of the boxes end up being filled in the same. And therefore, our genotypic ratio and phenotypic ratio is all of the children are going to be big A, little a, and all will have normal pigmentation, although they'll all be carriers for albinism. So that concludes our quick tutorial of how to solve Punnett squares and gives you a few examples of a few different types of problems that you could solve using them. And keep in mind that these Punnett Square procedures work for all Punnett squares, although interpreting the genotype ratio and phenotype ratio, and even sometimes figuring out the possible parents and gametes, does get a little bit more complicated when you go to non-Mendelian traits. We'll talk about some of those examples in class, but this is just to get you started.